Okay, so my plan to do chapters 3 and 4 as a joint video kind of did not go to plan. Needed to take a little bit of a rest break so I could give my throat a chance to recover. So now we are jumping back into the overview, but now our focus is going to be solely on chapter 4, which is entitled A Few Good Heterosexual Men, Inequality Described as Romance. So she starts this chapter off with the story of Gavin. And, he talks about his romantic preferences in terms of who he wants to date and how he envisions their dynamic. And there are some aspects of his some aspects of his discussion that highlight progressive elements, like the fact that he expects that the woman that he dates, that their relationship is, he likes that women are assertive. And he talks about, he's not a commitment phobic man. But then there are also these traditional elements. He describes his girlfriend as being accommodating. He emphasizes that it's important to him that he be taller than his partners because he wants to be stronger. And he says that he's uncomfortable with women who have had more sexual partners than he has. And so, she I think emphasizes his story because he starts off as sounding like, oh, okay, this guy isn't the traditional guy, that he doesn't have these traditional male views, and he doesn't think of himself as necessarily being the typical guy. But then as he starts talking about what he's looking for in a partner and the types of things that he's uncomfortable with in a partner, then all of a sudden he starts sounding a lot more traditional. And I think she's highlighting that contradiction in Gavin, because it's the contradiction that she sees in a lot of the men that are part of her sample. And she notes that heterosexual men experience a clash between change and tradition, that they are aware that there are some aspects of the traditional male and female dynamic that is no longer wanted or desirable. But then at the same time, they are also aware that there is support for some aspects of the traditional dynamic. And she does note that, the limitations of her sample when making this observation, because, her sample is limited to men with higher education and also men who are currently in the Bay Area. And so, of course, that might be influencing kind of their ideology, how conservative or liberal they are, as well as their acceptance for, things like feminism and egalitarianism, a point that she brought up in chapter 2 as well. So the primary question in this chapter is how heterosexual men balance their understandings of themselves as good egalitarian partners with conventional courtship practices and the expectations of their romantic partners. And she notes that a lot of them do seem less invested, what she describes as an ideological buy-in in these traditional rituals than the women. They don't necessarily give them as much significance and as the women do when they discuss, why they do them. Instead, why do they do them is pretty directly answered, that they do them because it's perceived as what women want, and they're being good men by giving women what they want. And they're not wrong in this perception, because of course in her last chapter she did establish that a lot of women do want these gendered traditional courtship practices. So men aren't wrong for assuming this. So should our conclusion be that women really have more power in this situation than what they do? Lamont pushes back, though, on that idea that women have more power in this courtship period than men. And she says at the bottom of page 80, in many ways, women's commitment to these norms and men's willingness to conform gave the initial sense that women had more power during the courtship period of the relationship, as women's willingness to enforce norms left men with few options. Yet, men remained very much committed to certain privileges they claim in their relationships, and these narratives allowed men to claim an identity as an equal partner without challenging certain benefits they accrue in their romantic relationships. So a big part of this chapter is going to be shining a light on maybe what those benefits and privileges that men have, by going along with these traditional gendered practices. So she first starts off by, dispelling some stereotypes, or at least dispelling some stereotypes, based on her sample. Most of her sample did not indicate they wanted to be the pursuer. And they noted, that when there's the pressure of being the pursuer, they too want to risk being rejected. Just because you're raised to be the pursuer and you're raised to shake off rejection, I would just like to emphasize, like, psychologically, like, rejection hurts, period. So it's wrong to assume that it doesn't bother men, just because they have been socialized to accept it in ways that women aren't. So they talk about the importance of men for reading signals, so that they know, like, what woman to pursue in order to lower their risk of rejection. Not to mention, she says they also want to avoid being perceived as overly aggressive and creepy. And she says, this is even pre-Me Too era. Still, with this educated group of men in a liberal area, there's already just, this awareness, it is bad to be the creepy, sleazy guy. And one way to avoid being that guy is by not pursuing women who aren't interested in you, and backing off when they indicate their lack of interest. So, they emphasize men are really out here, they don't enjoy the chase, and they don't necessarily like the game. But they do realize that, there is a game involved. And so they do talk about strategies like, how to call. You don't want to wait too long to call, but at the same time, you don't want to call too quickly and to appear overly eager. Paying for dates. This is maybe unsurprisingly, because it is their wallets, this is where we see a pretty big gender divide, because although men, say that, they will pay for dates and it is a way of demonstrating their financial stability, unlike women, they do not feel like this is a way of illustrating their commitment or desire for commitment. And in a perfect world, it seems like more men, at least in her sample, would like to share the cost on dates. And many of the men in her sample, they resented the expectation that they were going to pay, and that they were going to do that every time. One thing that I think is interesting is, although women indicated that they were more likely to pay as the relationship proceeded, men indicated that they were more willing to pay when the relationship progressed as well. So it's interesting. It seems like, men have a more positive feeling towards paying as the relationship becomes more serious. And that's also when women also were more apt to be willing to pay. So just an example of how, for heterosexual men and heterosexual women, the timing around, shared payment of dates, it isn't perfectly aligned. For the men who paid, they expected a certain reaction from women if they paid. And, that reaction necessarily isn't, you're going to sleep with me because I paid for dinner. But, they talked about the importance of not just being grateful, but like overt displays of gratitude. I guess, and she doesn't spend too much time there about what that necessarily looks like, but I would imagine it would mean, expressed enthusiastic thanks for picking up the bill. And Lamont notes, that although for her sample, economic limitations just isn't an issue, obviously, if this was a working class or working poor sample, this aspect of courtship can be. And so, this just raises the interesting question, you know, how does this play out in relationships where men aren't necessarily able to pay, but yet do women in those types of relationships and working class, working poor relationships, are they still using that as a benchmark of illustrating interest, or are they more understanding, and accepting of financial limitations? That's not a question that Lamont can answer, because that's just not a issue in her sample. Um, Men noted the expectation that they were to buy women's affections or participate in what is considered performative rituals, and that they understood that this was as much for the benefit as witnesses, as his partner, right? So you buy, as a man, you buy flowers and you send them to your girlfriend or your wife's office on her birthday or Valentine's Day, understanding that part of what's making her happy is not just the receipt of the flowers, but the receipt of the flowers in front of witnesses, that there's this performative aspect. And that's what's distinguishing, that gesture from a private gesture at home. Lamont doesn't get too deeply into, why is it so important for women, maybe more so than men, to have these performative aspects, to have people kind of witnessing, being treated in this way. And I think that's an interesting question to ask, as well as, whether or not that's a gendered kind of preference. But besides just kind of noting that men are aware, she doesn't go too deeply into it. She did say that for a lot of the men, they found this rigid enforcement of masculinity to be disconcerting. That they're dating these women who have, their own careers, that make their own money, but yet a lot of these women have very kind of rigid expectations around, having their dates paid for. They also discuss this rigid enforcement of masculinity, in regards to body type and height. And once again, just kind of emphasizing, the perception that men have that this stuff matters to women, and that women are acting upon these rather rigid expectations of masculinity. Men aren't making this up. This is supported by other data. So a lot of the social media sites track data about the interactions between their users. OkCupid has been kind of the most transparent about this, and they do show that for men, taller men receive more messages per week, until maybe they get too tall, and then there's a decline. and the same for women. That for a lot of women, there isn't a strong height preference that leads men to not reach out to them until the woman gets significantly taller, to the point where she just might be taller than a lot of men. And as noted by Gavin in the opening of the chapter, there are men that just aren't comfortable dating someone taller than them. But you can kind of see that for men, there is this kind of steady increase in the amount of messages you receive, kind of based on your height, at least up until about 6'2". And so just once again, just enforcing that idea, that perhaps even among women who identify as feminists, who say, that they do not want to be judged themselves by gender stereotypes, there might be some judgment and evaluation going on, directed towards men, at least in regards to things like, can they pay for a date and how tall are they? So one kind of reoccurring theme that she noted in a lot of their interviews is this positioning of themselves as being not like other guys. So they described and perceived other men in this stereotypical fashion. And once again, just noting, this isn't unexpected given what we know about the personal exception theory of gender. So when contrasting themselves to these other men, they oftentimes would highlight the ways in which other men are misogynistic, but they themselves support feminism. And so, she noted that most of her sample either professed to supporting feminism or being feminists themselves, and only two were directly against it. This is a good example of a finding that probably is predicated on her sample, their socioeconomic status, as well as their residence in a liberal area. Another way in which they like to compare themselves as being different from other men is they emphasize their emotional connection in their sexual relationships, especially now that they're older. And the fact that almost all of the men indicated that, they found sex within relationships more rewarding than casual sex. And a lot of them also emphasized how they too were looking for a relationship and frustrated in their abilities of not finding one. So all of that pushes against that stereotype, of course, that men, don't have a relational imperative, that men aren't out there looking for relationships the same way that women are. Now, where she did start to see, once again, kind of that more traditional male viewpoint is, when talking about past sexual experiences and sexual histories. A lot of men gave themselves pass on their sexual histories, but they were less generous with the women. And, that's not surprising given the persistence of the sexual double standard. There were subjective limits on what was deemed too many partners. Although, most of them didn't say that women had to have less sexual partners than they did. At the same time, they did feel like there was a number, upper limit that was defined as being too many. And they saw women who had casual sex, or sex for validation. And, they saw this as red flag behavior, or behavior that they deemed being a turnoff. And so, related to this, they had negative reactions or evaluations to women who initiated sex with them too quickly. What I thought was really interesting is the fact that Lamont noted that men are aware of upholding a sexual double standard. So they know that they're engaging in this kind of hypocritical evaluation, but most just don't seem very willing to challenge that standard themselves. And instead of reflecting on why they promote and uphold that standard, they instead offer justifications for the standard that absolve them from accusations of slut shaming or being insecure. So, they point to things like, oh, I think this is indicative of, her having, self-esteem issues, or, other types of concerns related to mental health, as opposed to saying, I'm just out here, engaging in some slut shaming, or maybe I'm insecure with my own kind of sexual, prowess and abilities. Like, they would never link it to, that type of explanation. And so, um, perhaps one of her least surprising observations was, though, men who, although a lot of men had a negative reaction to women initiating sex with them, it made them question her sexual history and her suitability as a partner. At the same time, once they were in a committed relationship with women, they were very positive about sex initiation. So they wanted a woman who initiated sex. They just basically weren't comfortable with her doing so until they were in a committed relationship, which is just further evidence, of course, for that, acceptance of the sexual double standard, even in these men who, in a lot of cases, either identify as being feminists or say that they support feminism. So then she talks once again, because this chapter is following the same structure as the chapter on women. She then talks about, proposing. And a lot of men did admit that it was their partner's desires that established the pace of the relationship. But at the same time, they didn't really have any strong feelings, negative feelings about that. So they didn't really express apprehension that that the woman was influencing the timing of the marriage proposal. And instead, they just really seemed to have the assumption that all women were eager to get married. And they also bought into the cultural stereotype that the proposal story was important to women. What perhaps is surprising is that, a lot of them indicated that they would be fine with a woman proposing to them. And the few who did not, they explained those feelings in the terms of, it's because they would be upset that, um, they weren't able to propose themselves because they saw that as something fun and exciting to do, but not that they necessarily thought it was their right or prerogative to do that. Um, so this kind of doesn't align with that kind of popular stereotype, right, that men are being manipulated and feeling pressured to propose, to the extent that women are influencing the timing of proposal. It doesn't seem like a lot of men, or at least the men in her sample, have an issue with that. Similar to their acceptance of the sexual double standard, where we start to see a little bit of complication around that is when she talked about the appearance of their partners. And I feel like it's very interesting, that, that there's this section for in the men's chapter, but, there wasn't that section in the women's chapter about appearance. And I don't know, because she doesn't really explain it. Is it because women just didn't really bring up the issue of appearance, the same way that men did, that just wasn't a quality of the heterosexual women interviews that stood out in any way. But what she noted in the men's interviews is oftentimes, as another example of their progressiveness, these men would highlight the fact that they had relationships with women, and accepted their supposedly undesirable physical traits. This was a way of, once again, distinguishing them from those supposed other men who are stereotypical men who only care about appearance. I don't know. I don't know about you guys, but that kind of just rubbed me the wrong way. Like, oh, I'm a feminist because I fell in love with a woman that has a funny nose, or like, oh, I'm progressive. Unlike other men, I don't care if my partner, has gained 20 pounds. I feel like that is a very iffy and low bar to point to, as signs of your progressiveness. And that if that is what a lot of men in her sample were doing, I would question, once again, what cultural messages they've received that have made them think that, that this is one way in which, an acceptable way in which to prove that you're progressive. She did note that, a few men did explicitly insist on conventional ideals of female beauty in their partners. But once again, perhaps maybe to try to avoid being labeled as superficial, they would go about doing this, especially if it was in regards to the body. They would go about doing this by phrasing it in terms of health and fitness, or the desire for a shared lifestyle, perhaps as a way of protecting themselves against like claims of them being superficial or sexist. So as we near the end of the chapter, she discusses that, men took two approaches to reconcile how their self-identified progressiveness, with their support for gendered courtship rituals and practices. So one way, and this is similar to one of the justifications that women offered, is they emphasized their desire to care for women. Like, I pay for dates, or I treat women in a certain way because I care for them. I'm taking care of them. And of course, that taking care of is really predicated on this idea, of course, that women are more emotional and they're weaker and they're more submissive. And so, once again, we have that discussion of how benevolent sexism comes into play here. The other approach is also similar to one of the justifications that women offered. They acknowledge inequality, but they emphasize all the ways in which they are egalitarian, which makes it seem like the ways that they're not is just a non-issue. So, they would say, they would say men can only change so much. And they would make light of it. They would make jokes, to kind of make it seem like the ways in which that they're not changing just aren't significant and aren't a big deal. And she did note that the gender conventions that established them as the symbolic head of the household were the ones most tightly embraced. So the ones kind of related to, for example, name changes, because, a woman changing or not changing her name after marriage was one of those uh, traditional practices that maybe men indicated they were most consistently supportive of, and they perhaps had the most ideological buy-in for, meaning it was really important to them and not just something that they were doing because they thought it made women happy. Um, and so, she observes that, these professional men are exposed to egalitarian ideals, and it has resulted in some changes in how they perceived women and approached relationships. But the reason why she can't just be 100% like positive about how much this generation of men have changed, and how much they are contributing to larger gender equality between men and women, is because most of these men refuse to view themselves as only partially changed. Like, so they are like over promoting, overstating, their level of gender progressiveness, when really, they still have work to do. The best example of that being that persistence of that sexual double standard. Um, and the fact that they expect a certain reaction for paying for dates, but not the obligation to do so. And so, that kind of once again says, it complicates that whole idea of choice theory. The idea that this is just individual choices or individual decisions or evaluations, because it is existing in that larger social context. So she ends the chapter with this quote from pages 105, 106. Progressive narratives serve as a form of identity work that allows these men to think of themselves as better than the average man without having to fully challenge gender inequality. Once marriage was on the horizon, heterosexual men were very invested in traditional symbolic gender norms. And so this is important because, of course, men and women both start off saying we want egalitarian marriages, and then how heterosexual men and women then act while dating, complicates that support for egalitarianism, because oftentimes they are engaging in these male dominated gender courting behaviors. And so then does it become surprising that when we, start looking at the marriages that these men and women have, oftentimes they're not living up to that egalitarian ideal. And so, that is where Lamont is going with this, right? She's wanting to know, how do we start with these ideals among men and women for egalitarianism, but then we end with marriages that are not as egalitarian as one would expect. And she is using kind of this dating pathway. She shines a light on that as being kind of an important precursor to what we then see when we look at how their marriages actually play out. And so that is it for chapter 4. In the next chapter, chapter 5, we're going to be shifting to her lesbian, gay, bisexual, those participants in her sample, and discussing their dating practices.